So, what are we doing here? Identifying whether a contract has been formed is important in order to determine whether the written conditions will form part of the offer and therefore be part of the contract. If there are written conditions, of course. So, MacRobertson is a really good case here. Again, I'm going to fly, so stop me verbally if you need me to talk about something. It's nice, relatively modern for contract law Australian case. This is actually a stamp duty case at the end of the day. So the question which came before the High Court was when a contract was made between an airline and a passenger. When and where. And the reason that the High Court, or ultimately was interested in this, is because the Commissioner for Stamp Duty in Western Australia basically wanted to impose a tax at the point where a ticket was issued. So the question before the court was, when and where is the contract made? Because if it's in Western Australia, then the Commission for Stamp Duty will be able to impose the tax. If it's made at some other point in time, then the tax won't be made. So again, often we have to come back and think about why do we need to know this thing? So this is a question about when and where is a contract made. So it's kind of a long-winded story, but it's important to understand how contracts are made, or what the process was, not necessarily how the contract is made. You're going to work that out from the case. So MacRobertson owned an airline and had a travel agent. So the way that it worked is passengers would go to the travel agent and say, I want to fly to Fiji, wherever they wanted to go. At that point in time, the travel agent or the airline would say, these are the flights that we've got available, these are the times that they're available, not terribly different from how it happens now, and this is how much they cost. The passenger would select a flight and they pay the fare. At that point, they would get a ticket. The ticket included a whole lot of terms and conditions, including a really broadly worded exemption clause. So an exemption clause, not unlike the exemption clause you're probably seeing on tickets that you buy to fly places today, effectively says, yeah, we can change the time of the flight, we can cancel the flight, we can move it around, we can do anything that we like. If we think you're drunk or unsafe, we're not going to let you on the flight, and we don't have any obligation to give you your money back unless you've paid for a particular type of fare that if you pay me more money, then I might give you some of the money back later on. That kind of thing. All sound familiar to you? And then on the time that the ticket says, you front up to the airport, the passenger fronts up, and if the plane is going, they go, and if they don't, the exemption clause in theory applies, or they might get moved, or any sorts of things could happen. So, MacRobertson, or the question I've talked about it being stamp duty, actually I've talked about having a broad exemption clause, so let's move on to the next slide. So MacRobertson makes, so what the airline said was, the ticket is actually only an offer to carry the passenger on a flight. And ultimately, by holding on to the ticket and not objecting to the terms that are there, and then turning up on the day, the passenger accepts that offer. They said that there was no contract formed by the ticket because there's no actual promise to carry the passenger, because they have this broad exemption clause. That promise is only made at the point when they let the person on the plane. The Commissioner, on the other hand, said that the offer and acceptance in the case of a purchase of an airline are absolutely mixed up. That this is one of the cases where we're looking for consensus because there is no clear offer, acceptance and communication. The ticket's the agreement because it gives rise to an obligation to carry the passenger, even though the exemption clause might mean they can get out of that right. This is further confusing because even though there is a majority judgment, in fact, all three judges find that the ticket doesn't record the terms of agreement, all three judges find that for different reasons. So it's a very confusing case to have so early on in the process, but it's important because particularly Justice Barwick's decision really gives a good summary of what the fundamental underlying rules are. And it shows the way that these three judges get there in different ways, shows the complexity of applying the rules to the issues or to the facts at hand. So Chief Justice Barwick said, because that exclusion clause is so broad, there is no obligation to carry. So in fact, it couldn't be a contract. So effectively, and we'll get back to this when we talk about certainty later, he was saying that because the clause was just written in such a broad way, it was effectively what we would call an illusory promise. There was no promise made, so there was a complete failure of agreement in the first place. Justice Stevens said, this is actually just a ticket case. We'll look at lots of ticket cases as we go. You will find when you finish this semester that you will no longer think about parking garages or dry cleaners or purchasing tickets to go anywhere in the same way. You will think about them very differently. You will probably still not read the terms and conditions, but you will think about them differently. So he says, as is the case with the rules with tickets, actually once you make a contract you can't add a new clause. So the contract's made at the time that there is an offer and an acceptance, so the offer of a range of different flights, it's accepted and paid for, then the ticket's issued. At that point, this new clause is introduced. Because this new clause is introduced after the contract's made, it doesn't count. So same idea, the ticket isn't the contract, but he's saying a contract was actually made, and it's made at the time and the place that that process is dealt with. Justice Jacobs sort of sat in between the two of them. He says, well, the ticket records the offer, and the offer can be accepted or rejected by a passenger when they've had some time to read it. So it sits somewhere in the middle. I'm going to skip that one because we're going to run out of time. I have to finish by 4, don't I? I will do that. So let's think about the kinds of conduct. Sorry, what have I?
Yeah, sorry, just with the last one. With the ticket case approach.
Sorry, your voice is not big enough for me. Please.
Sorry. With the ticket case approach, if you can't add new terms after the contract, so the contract already existed.
So effectively what he is saying is, so standard contract approach. Once a contract's been made, you can't add new terms. We'll talk about how you can vary and alter a contract as we move forward, but just take it as given that once we've reached agreement, you can't then say, oh, and by the way, let's add this other term later, without actually it being a new contract. So he's saying contract is made at the time that a flight is selected, a price is agreed. Contract's made then. Barwick saying, well, sorry, it wasn't Barwick, it was it was Stephen, wasn't it? Is saying, so you can't add this new term at this point.
But then underneath it says ticket equals offer.
Underneath, what? Ticket equals offer. I wonder why I'm saying, maybe he actually didn't, sorry, maybe I've remembered the facts incorrectly and my little notes on the slide are supposed to remind myself, because on that basis it still would work the same way. If he sees that the ticket is the offer, he would be saying that, well, you can't make the contract then until the ticket is issued. And so at the end of the day, well, because, no, that doesn't make sense. Sorry, I'm going to have to go back to my own notes as to why I've put that on the slide. Sorry, you wanted to...
I was just wondering if he meant that, like, the ticket is a new offer that's accepted when you board the plane.
I can't remember enough about the facts of the case to remember it. I didn't read that one in my preparation for today. The point of having this case is actually to show just how confusing these... So you can get 3 different judges, get to the same result in 3 different ways, dealing with exactly the same sort of law. At the end of the day, this case is authority for nothing, really, because we get a result, but we don't have any consistency in the way that we get it. there. The point of the case is, as much as anything, to look at what's useful. Justice Barwick's decision is really useful from pointing out what the underlying rules are. That's the benefit for you in reading it. And then there's the whole benefit for you in seeing that I am human and that I'm not carrying it around in my head. But I will make a note to actually look up and answer that. Gabby?
Sorry, just to clarify, so they decided that the ticket didn't imply a contract, nor did the fact that he had selected a price and had paid a price. That wasn't a contract either.
I can't remember off the top of my head. I think some of them thought that earlier contract, that there was a contract before the ticket was issued.
Yeah. Okay.
But that this broad exclusion clause. What was interesting about it is because there has seemed to be social reasons why an airline should be able to have complete control over whether they take off or not. And that if airlines were to be sued every time they didn't take off on time for breach of contract, that would be difficult. How that's actually played out in real life is that the terms and conditions, when they're appropriately put together, allow that latitude but still require the promise and the obligation. So, you know, it's one thing, yes, an airline can cancel your flight, but you have a contract with them, which means that if they do that, they have to find an alternative for you. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be convenient or anything, but they can do those things. But that I just don't remember the timing off the top of my head. Sorry, it's been a week. You're looking confused. Somebody wants to throw something at me, that's fine.